Days of Our Lives divulges that Kristen DeMera, Stacey Heideck, is ready to recant her statement about shooting EJ DeMera, Dan Feuerriegel, so that her daughter Rachel Black, Lorelei Olivia Moat, can confess to the crime. So the plan was for Kristen to have all charges against her dropped and Rachel to get a slap on the wrist or no consequences, preferably. Brady Black, Eric Martsolf, and Belle Brady, Martha Madison, just warned Kristen to mind her manners when they're in session with the judge. But let's be real. When is Kristen ever chill? We're going to talk about what might happen if she acts out. All right, let's dig into it. So, with Kristen recanting her confession that she made in court, that's saved. She wanted to save Rachel. This could be the moment where everything's all cleaned up, all the loose ends are tied. Kristen gets her freedom. It would all be good. Except Belle doesn't think that Kristen is going to be able to do this. She doesn't think she's going to do it right. So Kristen came over to Brady's place where she's living temporarily after she visited her mom, Rachel Blake, at Alamania. And Kristen said she and her mom were redoing her will because her brother, Peter Blake, Dan Gauthier, is now dead and gone. Kristen was already emotional when she barged in on Brady and Belle talking this week. And then the siblings were making small talk about the new place being close to Rachel's school and Marlena Evans' Deidre Hall townhouse. And then the conversation turned to Kristen and Rachel's upcoming hearing. So I'm sure you remember she burst into the courtroom during Johnny DeMera's Carson Boatman trial when he was facing attempted murder charges for allegedly shooting his dad. And right before that, EJ had remembered everything, and he had a flashback of little Rachel shooting him. So EJ insisted that Kristen had to confess to the shooting herself to save Johnny. Otherwise, EJ was going to have to reveal that Rachel did it, which he didn't want to do. But also, EJ wasn't going to risk his son's freedom to save her daughter. So it was a messy situation. Kristen confessed, and at that point, only she, EJ, and Marlena knew that Rachel was the shooter. And Marlena said they should let Rachel remember in her own time to minimize the mental health impact of all of this drama, which meant Kristen was sent to Statesville and then Peter kidnapped Kristen, stole her right from prison. And then, of course, Rachel eventually remembered shooting EJ. And then Brady made the very tough decision to put Rachel in Bayview for full time psychiatric care. And she was making progress until Sophia Choi, Rachel Boyd, began targeting Rachel and manipulating her and encouraging the tween to do naughty things and basically using her as her minion. And if not for Sophia, the doctors at Bayview might have made a lot more progress with Rachel. I think they made some, but not as much as they could have. But Kristen ignored medical advice from the therapist, ignored advice from Marlena, ignored Brady's wishes. And she yanked Rachel out of Bayview and brought her back home. And Belle warned at the time that this could mess up the hearing because Rachel being in Bayview was what was keeping her out of juvie. And then Kristen wormed her way into moving in with Brady and told Gwen Rizchek, Emily O'Brien, that even though Brady said she could stay for a month, Kristen said she wasn't planning on ever moving out. So she's been scheming from the jump. And at this point, Brady and Belle are very worried about what's going to happen at that hearing because Kristen checking Rachel out may not go over well with the judge. Her being in Bayview meant she was getting help and facing some consequences, but not the worst possible consequences she could face since she shot her uncle. But Kristen stopped all the help she was getting at the most crucial time. And in a way, I think it's because she wanted to use Rachel as a bargaining chip to get closer to Brady. And he made it perfectly clear to Kristen, don't mislead the judge on our living arrangements. Brady said it needs to be made clear he and Kristen are not a couple. They are co parenting and agreed to be together to help Rachel transition back into life in Salem after 6 months at Bayview. So, Rachel has gone back to seeing her original therapist, which didn't stop her from doing what she did, but she is doing pretty well in school. But all of that may not be enough. Belle warned Kristen they are facing the same exact judge that presided over Johnny's case. So, this is the same judge who saw Kristen burst into her courtroom to dramatically confess to shooting EJ. So, Belle said this judge is going to go over every little detail with a fine tooth comb. And, this is probably the worst judge they could have drawn. And given Kristen's emotional state after losing Peter and then finding out the bones in the crypt were her dad, Stefano DeMera's, Joe Mascolo, there's no telling what she may say if she gets pressed by the judge. Belle already warned Kristen that she needs to calmly recount her confession and then basically keep her mouth shut after that. And she was glaring at Belle, who told her if she doesn't keep it zipped, she could get Rachel's freedom taken away. They could possibly lose custody of their daughter. But then, talking to Brady, Belle brought up Sarah Horton, Lindsay Godfrey, and that set Kristen off. So she stormed off, and Brady had to apologize to Belle for how she was acting. However, let's be real. Kristen may not be able to help herself if she gets snarky with the judge. Rachel could be remanded to juvie or back to Bayview or another mental ward, out of state or farther from Salem. They could actually take custody of her away from Kristen and Brady, especially with her history of CPS incidents. So, if Kristen starts blathering about how Bayview wasn't helping Rachel and they did a bad job with her therapy, it could all go real bad real fast. Kristen could rant about Dr. Gregory, the therapist, and about how Sophia Choi was a bad influence and do it with zero tact. That would be a typical Kristen thing to do. And if you recall at the time that she confessed and falsely said that she shot EJ, it was, a sweet sacrifice, a mother's love in an attempt to keep Rachel out of juvie. That surprised everybody that she would sacrifice herself like that, especially Brady. But Kristen also snapped at EJ once they found out the jury was going to come back with a not guilty verdict for Johnny. I think it was maybe Leo Stark Greg Ricart who told them that. So Kristen somehow thought EJ should have known it was going to be a not guilty and, could have stopped her from confessing and everybody would have been fine. So right now, Rachel's happy to be home again and she wants to tell the truth and save her mom, Kristen. But given that Alice Halsey wrapped her run at Days of Our Lives and she already had her last air date last week, they have to do something with Rachel. And as big a deal as they're making out of this hearing, I feel like that's going to determine her fate. So my money is on Kristen doing something or saying something that ticks off the judge, and that gets Rachel sent away. Because maybe they think Kristen is a bad influence, whether it's to juvie or another psychiatric hospital that's further away. Kristen, may pitch a fit about Bayview and they say, okay, well, we'll put her here. That's in a whole other state. I suspect we are going to see Rachel sent away in some capacity as a result of this hearing, but we'll see.